Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to this webinar on how to improve grant application success with Altmetric tools and data. So just to carry on, just to introduce our speakers for the day, go to the next slide. My name's Josh. I'm the marketing manager at Altmetric, and I deal with the sort of day-to-day messaging for Altmetric, including things like social media, our blog, some of our events, emails, and webinars just like this one. And I'm joined today by my colleague Stacey, who's the Director of Research Relations and Altmetric, and who coordinates all our efforts with and external relationships with that of the Scientometrics community. So if we just carry on, I'll just go over what we'll be covering today. We're going to kick off with a little bit of housekeeping just to make sure everyone has the best webinar experience they can. Then we'll dive into the tips for using Altmetric data and tools to improve grant applications. That's with my colleague Stacey. And then at the end, we'll leave some time for Q&A. Just to go over the housekeeping, the webinar is being recorded. About staying till the end if you're unable to. All registrants will receive a link to the recording tomorrow, and it will be available on YouTube and our Figshare channel, as well as our new Go to Stage on-demand webinar channel. So if you do need to check out the recording at a later date, it will be available indefinitely. All attendees are currently muted, but if you do have any technical issues, please send the host a little private message in the chat box. So if you can't see the slides or the sound goes off, do let us know in the little chat box that you can see in the GoToWebinar control panel there. And also, if you do have any questions to ask us, please feel free to type them into the chat box for the Q&As on the GoToWebinar dashboard throughout the webinar as you think of them, and we'll get to them at the end and try to get to everyone's questions. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Stacey to kick us off with the tips for using Altmetric in your grant applications.
Excellent. Thank you, Josh. So if you're here today, you probably already know that in most grant applications, you are asked to talk about the importance of your previous work, why you in particular are best suited to be funded to undertake a certain topic of study. And you're typically asked to provide in these grant applications narratives for your planned research that's specifically rooted in your past experience and your expertise. So with that in mind, we have a few questions. So how can you, in your narrative, in your references that you also typically submit with a grant application, how can you showcase the impact of your past work? And how can you explain the public influence of your research? How might you characterize the non-traditional scholarly impact of your work beyond just being cited? And how can you explain the impact of recently published works? So the answer to all of these, as you might guess, is of course Altmetrics. And this is for two reasons. So one is that Altmetrics have this key advantage in that they allow you to see early feedback on recently published work. So they allow you to see in near real time how people are engaging with your research so that you can start to understand the impact of the research much more immediately than with citations. Citations, as we know, they can take months, if not years, to start to accumulate. Altmetrics, you can publish a paper tomorrow and have your altmetrics for your paper immediately start to accumulate as it gets shared across social media, as it gets picked up in the mainstream media and written about in news and blogs, as it starts to get cited in public policy and mentioned in patents months down the line. So this early feedback, we talk a lot in altmetric circles about how this early feedback is really good specifically for early career researchers, that is graduate students and postdocs who maybe are going out for jobs and they need to explain the impact of papers that they've only recently published when they're in their job interview, or even just at the resume stage. They need to explain, with their submission package, here's why the work that I'm doing is impactful and you should hire me. In a similar way, let's say you're undertaking a fairly new field of study, one that you yourself have started to forge this path forward with maybe some other researchers in your field, or maybe it's transdisciplinary. And this research is so new that when you start to apply for grants for this research, you're not really well cited yet. People are reading your work, people are talking about your work, and people are citing your work, but those citations are not going to show up in the published literature for months or years because of just the nature of the publication process taking a long time. So Altmetrics can showcase the early signals to later impacts and later influence in the scholarly literature in a much more immediate fashion. The second reason why altmetrics are especially advantageous to use in grant applications is, excuse me, because they help you to find broader impacts for your work. So citations are really good at showing impact, but it's a very specific and narrow kind of scholarly interest in work. Altmetrics, on the other hand, they can showcase influence on public policy, on the culture at large, on practitioners like doctors and clinicians and other stakeholder groups that are actually talking about research, engaging with research, and putting it into action. So with the speed of altmetrics and altmetrics' ability to find and showcase broader impacts in mind, let's talk about two ways that you can think about using altmetrics data in grant applications. So the first is integrating this data into narratives, and the second is adding this data into your supporting references. We're going to go through a number of examples over the next few minutes. We're going to just fly through them, but we will showcase how this data can be integrated into a narrative. We're going to spend most of our time on that because the putting this data into your supporting references, I think, in my opinion anyway, it tends to be fairly straightforward. So let's talk at length about narrative. So as you know, researchers really have to think about creating this coherent narrative about the relationship between their work and their impact. So what are they doing that's making a difference in the world? But I've really found that researchers have a tough time articulating that impact. It's easy to look up citations and to explain what journal your research has been published in when you're talking about, I'm so great, I got a paper in Science or what have you. However, when it comes to talking about those broader impacts of your work, it can sometimes be a lot more challenging to find those examples and to share that data, that evidence in a meaningful way with other people. So let's look at some examples of what this could look like using specifically data from public policy mentions, mass media mentions, patent mentions, and a little bit of social media mentions. So first, let's look at patent citations in this paper on surgery for the treatment of epilepsy. If I look at the altmetric details page for this paper, you see lots of pretty colors. You see lots of metrics on the left-hand side. But if you click through to the actual patents themselves, you start to get really important information. First of all, you see the specific patents that are citing this paper, that are using a piece of research as the basis for making a claim, to innovation and to technologies and commercialized technologies that can be built on the basis of this foundational research. If you click through the patents themselves, you can start to read them, especially if you have access to something like Dimensions. You can look at the full text as well to see how exactly is this research forming the basis of this patent and the past research. Similarly, for policy citations, you can really dive deep into these to find meaningful bits of evidence that showcase broader impacts for your work. So looking at the policy citations for the same paper, we see that this piece of research has informed documents published by the World Health Organization, by the CDC, and others that are really important in the field of NGOs and other types of public policy. And here is the reference in the public policy itself. So you can look at the context, you can see how it's actually being used, and you know now that These patent mentions and these policy document mentions, these all point to the article as providing foundational knowledge and accepted practice in surgical treatment of epilepsy. So the question now is, how do we actually put that into words? Let's take a look at an example. So this is one way that we could start to form a narrative about this research impact. You can integrate both numerical data, like the number of policy documents that cite this piece, excuse me, along with important contextual data, like who is citing research and how it's being applied, to start to signal the influence and the importance of a paper. So now let's take a look at using mass media attention in a similar way. So this paper was published in 2016, doesn't have a lot of citations yet, but it's gained extensive mass media interest and attention online. So it's been mentioned in 23 news outlets, including the BBC, PBS, Scientific American, and others. And in the case of psychology research like this that's related to stigma, what's really important, right, is that this research is getting mentioned in outlets where people like hiring managers are likely to see it. So a hiring manager in your typical organization may never end up reading the paper that's published in the journal itself. They may never end up reading that original research, but the message and the conclusions of the research can be communicated via mass media, and that's what's happening here. So this is how we could potentially articulate the engagement with the research and the attention and the potential for impact. And what's important to stop and point out here is that actual evidence of impact is something that numerical data, altmetrics, citations are rarely going to be able to capture in and of themselves. What all of these types of data are really good at capturing are so-called pathways to impact. These bits of evidence that show that there's a potential for hiring managers to see this work and for individuals to actually act upon the findings of this piece of research. And similarly, a citation to a research in a patent, like we saw previously, doesn't mean that someone has necessarily actually used the data to develop a new invention or to monetize research and start to build value based on this research. What it means is there's a potential there. And the potential is typically what we are talking about when we're talking about these narratives that you're creating, especially for recently published research. Now, in many cases, you will have other kinds of impact, the non-numerical kinds of impact statements and evidence that you can put into this narrative that go very nicely alongside the pathways to impact. But this is what we are working with. They're these bits of evidence that show there is a large potential for impact and influence based on this research. So here's one final example from the field of environment and building design. So again, we see that this paper doesn't really have a lot of attention online. It's only been cited 4 times, but it's been cited in the heat wave guideline for cities that's been published by Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Center. So this is how we could form a narrative about this research impact. This particular policy document is likely widely read and highly influential worldwide as cities are now grappling with climate change. And so this points to an important potential impact for this paper. Here's another paper, another example of policy citation. So this paper about rotavirus rates after vaccination, it doesn't have a very high altmetric attention score. It's not been talked a lot about on social media. It's got 0 attention in the mass media, but it did receive policy attention, and it was cited in 23 weekly Public Health England norovirus reports. So this study really served as a benchmark of success of the vaccines and the monitoring of norovirus levels. So very important in that it was influencing these weekly reports that go out to healthcare practitioners across England. So finally, I want to talk about using altmetrics and references. And I'll just talk very briefly about this because the concept itself is fairly straightforward, and there's some specific best practices that are relatively easy to follow. So if I wanted to include Altmetric's information to start to explain the broader impacts of my work or the impacts of recently published work, but let's say I didn't have a lot of space to do it in my narrative, I ran out of space in my narrative talking about how amazing I am already and how important my work is, but I want to also include other signals elsewhere. I could consider adding metrics to the end of the references that I tend to submit with grant applications, specifically in the sciences. This is a typical practice. So, for example, this first example here on the grant application supporting references, this lists the excuse me, relative citation ratio for this particular paper. So this is a citation-based metric that showcases how highly cited a paper is or is not compared to similar papers published in the same time period. This this example showcases the broader societal impact. It shows that this particular paper that we just looked at was cited in 23 weekly Public Health England norovirus reports. So just a side note here, it's always really good, it's good practice to talk about where you retrieved these metrics from. So we see here with our CR that we've got the data from Dimensions. We see with this Public Health England norovirus reports that data comes from Altmetric. This allows people who are looking at your grant application to go and retrieve the data for themselves if they want to. We also see here in supporting reference number 3, an additional use of metrics that give a sense of comparatively how much attention a piece of research has received. So we see that this paper is within the top 4% of all papers published in science. And that data comes from Altmetric. It's based on the Altmetric attention score, which we saw in the Altmetric donut in some previous examples. So that is how this data can be used in both building narratives and in references. And I'm going to hand it back over to Josh to talk specifically about using Altmetric's tools to retrieve this data.
Fantastic, thanks so much, Stacey. Yeah, we just want to click over to the next slide. So just going to talk about the Altmetric Explorer for institutions. This is an intuitive platform that makes it easy to monitor, track, and report the online mentions to published research. You can search and report on the Altmetrics for over 26 million research outputs for your own institution and that of other institutions. The platform has been specifically designed to find evidence of reach and the broader influence of published research so that you can help funders understand the benefits and intended impact of your research in grant applications. So if we click through, next slide. Thanks. So yeah, the Explorer for Institutions provides the ability to search for specific funders to see the work that they're funding. This means that you can also see the online engagement that has been received for yours and other institutions' funded research, as well as searching for specific funders to see what projects they have funded. You can explore and see the full text mentions that your publications have received and report on things like trends in the engagement for specific research outputs to uncover information that could be used in grant renewals. You can search for publications by other researchers. This would be particularly useful for researchers in your own institution, as they may want to write about other people's research in their own applications. Finally, last point, you can also do batch searches for publications and report on things like attention highlights just with one click. As you can see there, that is actually a screenshot from the Explorer where you can actually see things like the most mentioned outputs, where and by who your research is being most mentioned by, latest news mentions, and things like Twitter demographics for where your research is And that's all viewable in just one click with the Explorer. So if you want to go on to the next slide, to find out more about Altmetric and our products and tools, do check us out on YouTube and Figshare, where you can find videos, shorter videos, as well as the longer kind of webinars about specific topics, to just find out about specific uses of our tools and the data itself. You can also check us out on SoundCloud and iTunes, where we now have the Altmetric podcast, where we speak to the author of a piece of research that was published the previous month that has seen a particularly high amount of engagement. And that's all from us. If anybody has any questions, please do feel free to put them in the questions box and we'll try to answer them. Do we have anything? Can't see anything at the moment.
So we do have one question so far. This is from Azel, who has asked, what does RCR stand for? And that is a great question. So RCR stands for the term relative citation ratio. And this is a metric that was developed by the NIH a few years back. And basically, what it does is it looks at a paper's co-citation network. So the other papers that the paper has is similar to, essentially. They don't use the journal as the standard necessarily to develop this co-citation network. They just look at similar papers that are being cited. And they look at the overall number of citations that those papers have received and create basically a baseline that they compare the paper in question to. So an RCR of 1.0 is a paper that is standard. It's got the same citation rates as other papers in the comparison set. So it is just purely they meet the threshold, they meet the baseline. An RCR of less than 1 means that it is less cited than other papers in its cohort. An RCR of more than 1 means that it's more highly cited than other papers in its cohorts. And the higher up you get there, the better. So another question has come through. How can one actively improve altmetrics for their papers? Josh, do you want to talk a little bit about strategies for engagement online?
So yeah, we actually have some really great guides for this actually on our Figshare page. So if you go to Figshare and search Altmetric, you can actually find click through to all of our guides that are on Figshare. That we've actually got one specifically for promoting your research. We find that researchers can find many ways in which can work for their research. We would recommend perhaps using Altmetrics to maybe initially find maybe other researchers who have published in your same area and see the kind of engagement they've had, or maybe where they've spoken about their research online, but also to kind of work with the channels that work for you as a researcher. So you may prefer to do things like write a summary of your research and put it on something like a blog, and then promote that on Twitter or other social media platforms. There are various other channels that may work for you, may work better for you. We actually have a blog post with a really great research communicator, Silita Guy, that's on our blog on the Altmetric website, where she talks about, she's very experienced about communicating research, and she talks about creating strategies and things she might do, such as things she actually talked about press releases for her research, which is quite interesting. But yeah, these are just one way. I would recommend having a look at the Altmetric blog for that interview with Silita, which was a couple of months ago, I think. Or again, yeah, our Figshare page, where you will find there is a one-pager guide, which you will surely find very, very interesting for this. So yeah, that's probably how I would go about that. there any more questions? Stacey, I don't think I can see them on my panel.
Yes, I believe there's another one that Aisel would like to ask. You can go ahead, Aisel. Just waiting for that to come through. Oh, there's a question here about the Dimensions tab. So Dimensions is a linked research data platform, not unlike traditional ANI databases like Web of Science and Scopus, in that you can use it to find publications, but it also includes a lot more. So we clicked through two dimensions from a patents tab. So Dimensions indexes patents, grant information, clinical trial data, and public policy documents related to specific topics. You can access Dimensions for free if you just Google dimensions.ai. Basically, in the free version, you'll be able to search over 105 million papers. You can save them to your local reference managers and use that for personal uses. It's totally free for personal use. If you're interested in learning more about accessing patent information and other things like that, you can get in touch with the Dimensions team, who'd be more than happy to talk. All right, it's 9:30 my time. I'm sure different for everyone else on this line, since this is a worldwide webinar. So let's go ahead and adjourn for the day. Thank you everyone for attending. Thank you to my fabulous co-host Josh for putting this webinar together. We really appreciate everyone's attention, and we hope you have a great day. Thanks very much.